Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today, we are going to be covering Michael Russo and Joe Smith's recent article in The Athletic, discussing potential trade options for the Minnesota Wild ahead of the NHL trade deadline. I organized these different players into kind of three separate categories: trades that I don't think are going to happen, trades that I think might be somewhat likely, and then players that I think are the most likely targets for the team at this trade deadline. I also tacked on a few dark horse candidates that I like that Russo and Smith do not have listed here, but I've either seen them rumored elsewhere or I think are players that could be a good fit for Minnesota ahead of March. So, funnily enough, as I'm sitting here getting ready to record this video, one piece that Russo mentioned in the article has been dealt. So, Kiefer Sherwood of the Vancouver Canucks, who's been rumored to have interest from the Wild since before their acquisition of Quinn Hughes, has been dealt in division to the San Jose Sharks for 2 second-round picks and depth defenseman Cole Clayton. Sherwood is on an expiring contract and should help bolster the middle six of a very young San Jose core, help give them some forechecking as they hope to compete for a playoff spot. I think this is a really nice trade for both sides. I think Vancouver probably couldn't get a first round pick for Sherwood. That's at least what the 2 seconds indicates to me, which is somewhat surprising to me given that he's only making $1.5 million this year. And I think it's great value for San Jose to bring in a little bit more of a veteran. Again, they have a really, really young core. I mean, Celebrini's only 19 over there. You've got a lot of kind of college aged kids that are running the top six of that team and on the defensive side as well. And so I think that getting a guy like Sherwood and hopefully they can lock him up, I think is a great add for this organization, especially for a couple second round picks when you already have a really stacked prospect pool like San Jose does. I don't think they need to be hoarding draft capital anymore. I think they can pull the trigger on guys like Sherwood and help bolster their forward core. Like I mentioned, that's one guy that Russo and Smith had in their article. So I will not be talking about him in the context of the Wild potentially acquiring him, but let's dive into some of the other names that were mentioned. So the first name in my not going to happen list of trade candidates is Artemi Panarin. He's certainly going to be probably the best forward traded at the deadline this year. And coming from a New York Rangers team that is surprisingly struggled as much as they have, he is certainly going to fetch New York a nice package in return. He's led the Rangers in scoring every single year since he signed there in 2019-2020. However, for the Wild trading for him, I think it will just end up costing way too much. And additionally, I think that the process of re signing Panarin is probably something that the team is not really interested in going through. He does have the same agent that Kirill Kaprizov has. And so I have a sneaking suspicion. I know Russo mentioned this in the article as well, that there's probably not a big appetite to go back to the drawing board and renegotiate with the same guy that got Kaprizov $17 million. Additionally, Panarin is 34, and he does have some pretty serious off ice baggage in that he had to settle a sexual assault allegation that was made last year. The Athletic has a great article on that by Katie Strang. I'd highly recommend checking it out. But I think acquiring Panarin would be too expensive, and I think it would create a distraction for the fan base and for the team that would prevent them from focusing on winning the Stanley Cup. And so I doubt Panarin is going to be somebody that the team seriously goes after at the deadline. So the next guy that was brought up was JT Miller. And I do not think that JT Miller is going to end up playing for the Minnesota Wild after this trade deadline. Uh, Even though the Rangers have announced that they are retooling, they're not rebuilding, and they aren't re-signing Artemi Panarin, I don't think that same logic applies to them trading a guy like Miller. He is their captain. He also has 4 years remaining after this season at $8 million a year. which means that you're taking on a pretty sizable amount of term, and he is an extremely good face-off taker. He's got a 60.9 face-off win percentage this season, as well as a full no move clause by the Rangers. So, given that term in the clause, I'm not sure the Rangers will shop him, let alone move him, as well as with the direction the team is going of a retool versus a rebuild. Additionally, there's not a super clear understanding of what exactly transpired in Vancouver as a part of the whole JT Miller, Bo Horvat, and Elias Pettersson situation that resulted in Horvat initially leaving and then later JT Miller. Uh, but I think Miller would be another player that would create unneeded distractions for the Wild team, especially after adding Quinn Hughes. So I know Russo and Smith mentioned in their article, if you are seriously considering acquiring Miller, I think it would hinge on a very long, lengthy conversation with Quinn Hughes about what exactly went down. Because at least publicly, there's not a very solid understanding, and a lot of it is speculative. But I think a trade like that would have to hinge on if Quinn Hughes is fine with JT Miller joining the team. And again, I think he would just cost too much uh, in order for the Wild to acquire him. So up next was a player that I didn't even remotely have on my trade board coming up here on the trade deadline, and that is Robert Thomas from the St. Louis Blues. He's a 26-year-old right shot centerman who is great friends with Quinn Hughes, and he does have a 52.3 faceoff win percentage this season and has traditionally been a point per game player in St. Louis. Additionally, on his contract after this year, he still has 5 years left at $8.125 million. So he's on one of the nicest value contracts in the league. However, I think there are quite a few complicating factors for Robert Thomas being an acquisition by the Minnesota Wild. So, first off, the Blues are obviously a big division rival. Typically, teams will not trade star players of Thomas's caliber within the same division. And as such, I think a trade would cost way too much to pick him up. Additionally, the Blues are on paper a very good team. Uh, you look at their core here. You've got guys like Jake Neighbors, Braden Shen, Jimmy Snuggerud, Dylan Holloway, Jordan Kyrou, Dalibor Dvorsky. All of these guys that should be scoring a lot more than they are. And like you go through, and the only guy who's significantly above half a point per game is Robert Thomas, and he's currently injured. And so I think the Blues are a prime candidate of a team that's going to retool at the deadline. I don't think they're trading out a guy like Robert Thomas. I think they're going to trade out potentially another guy that I'll talk about later. But I think Robert Thomas is not going to be traded at the deadline. I think if there is a trade for Robert Thomas, by anybody. It feels more like a move that would happen in the offseason once the direction of the Blues is a little bit more clear than it currently is. So these next few guys are also in the not going to happen category, but I think they're pretty cut and dry that they're sticking with their current teams. So I'm just going to briefly run through them, starting off with Ryan O'Reilly. It would be a reunion with the Wild. He had part of his contract retained by the team when he was dealt to Toronto before he ended up signing in Nashville. Earlier this season, there was speculation he could be traded as Nashville struggled out of the gate. However, the team has gotten hot as of late, and he did publicly say that he wants to be part of the solution in Nashville and helping them turn the team around. So I don't expect Nashville to be trading anybody. That goes for Ryan O'Reilly and Steven Stamkos, unless they get a pretty steep offer that is kind of a too good to refuse type of deal. The next two guys that Russo and Smith mentioned are Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin. Uh, that being said, I don't think either of these guys leave the Pittsburgh Penguins. Everything linking them to the Wild is tangential at best, whether it be them playing with Guerin, Marc-Andre Fleury being on the Minnesota Wild staff, there being plenty of Russian players that could entice Malkin to come, especially. But there aren't any actual indicators that either of them want to be traded or will actually get traded. And I think even as a rental, both of them would cost an arm and a leg to acquire, and would likely necessitate moving a guy like Jesper Wallstedt or Danila Yurov, plus a lot of other significant assets, which I don't think for the long run is good business for the team to be engaging in. So I don't think either of them will ever wear anything other than a Penguin sweater, and especially not at this trade deadline. So the first guy that I have in the somewhat likely category is a guy that I really like as a potential trade option, but I'm just not sure what he will end up costing, and that is Brayden Schenn from the St. Louis Blues. So Schenn is a 34-year-old left shot centerman, standing at 6'1", and he does have a 15-team no trade list on his contract. After this year, he does have 2 more years remaining at $6.5 million per season. And the biggest question mark for Schenn as to what his value will be is his drop in production. So this year he's got 19 points in 49 games played. However, Schenn has historically been a pretty consistent 50 to 60 point guy. He's also a very reliable two-way faceoff taker. This season, he's got a 54.1 faceoff win percentage, which I think is more so what the team needs. I think Schenn would be a fantastic addition to the Wild. I think he's probably one of the guys that I like the most that they could pick up. But I think him getting traded, especially being the captain of the Blues, will entirely depend on what direction the Blues decide to go at by the time March rolls around. If they are fully set on selling the old core off in favor of building more around Kyrou and around Thomas, I could see Schenn getting moved. Or if they're trying to retool and compete next season, that's where it gets a little bit more complex. However, I also can see them, regardless, not wanting to trade Schenn this year because of that cratered production. I mean, going from a pretty consistent 50 to 60 point per year player to have 19 points in 49 games is a pretty steep drop off, and especially at 34, they may decide that they'd rather hold on to Brayden Schenn than trade him because they're not entirely certain if they can get the value they would want out of a trade. So I think him getting dealt is entirely dependent on the direction the Blues end up deciding to take. But I think if he is somebody who starts to get more clearly shopped by the team, he's a great candidate that the Wild should target. So lastly, of the guys that Russo and Smith mention in their article is a guy that Russo has very clearly pointed out the team has not called on yet, but is somebody that I've had circled as a player the Wild should acquire and have for a couple years now in Vincent Trocheck. Trocheck is a great face-off taker. As Russo pointed out, he's had about 55% face-off win rate since 2016-2017, and this year he's at 55.6%. So he's a great face-off taker down the middle. He's a right shot centerman, which the team is lacking, especially on that first power play. He also has 3 years remaining after this year at $5.625 million a year. So he's on a great contract for the quality of player he is. He's got 29 points in 35 games played, which is good for an 0.83 point per game pace. Bill Guerin also clearly likes him as a player. He's repeatedly picked him for international play, and he will be representing the U.S. at the upcoming Olympics. However, Russo and Smith do point out that the price may be too much for what the Wild are looking based on recent center trades. They cite Brock Nelson. I do think there's a little bit of a difference when it comes to Trocheck and Brock Nelson. Nelson is significantly taller, which does seem to matter to GMs, especially for centermen. Nelson is 6'4", Trocheck is 5'11". However, I think Trocheck is the type of guy that I would part with a first round pick and kind of one of the B tier prospects the team has of like a Riley Height, a Carson Lambos, somewhere in there where you can try and make up the pick value by trading out an asset you may have drafted a little bit higher but may not have a clear role on the team going forward. I don't think I would chop a Jesper Wallstedt or a Danila Yurov, and I'm hesitant even to trade a Charlie Stramel for Trocheck. I really am a big fan of Charlie Stramel. I think he is going to be an Eriksson Ek type player. And so I don't know if I would trade him for Trocheck, but I think Trocheck is a phenomenal potential ad for this team at the deadline. So now we're going to move into what, in my opinion, is the more fun section of this video, which is talking about kind of my dark horse candidates for trades, which, if you recall, are guys that Smith and Russo don't mention in their article, but are guys that nonetheless I think the team should be targeting as trade pieces. So starting off the list is a reunion with centerman Charlie Coyle of the Columbus Blue Jackets. So Coyle is a right shot center. He would be a rental from Columbus. He is at the end of his 6-year, $5.25 million contract. He is 6'3" and has won 50.6% of his faceoffs this season. He also has some pretty solid production this year, having 30 points in 48 games, and is locked in as the third center on the Columbus team. However, I think Coyle being traded would hinge on Columbus falling out of the playoff race by the time the playoff or the trade deadline rolls around. And the change of coaching from Evison to Rick Bowness could change the priority of the team a little bit. It seems like they are trying to still make the playoffs, so it makes trading out a centerman like Coyle a little bit less likely if they still are by the time that trade deadline rolls around. But given the fact that Guerin has dealt with Waddle before, obviously acquiring Juracek, I think there is a reasonable possibility of a reunion happening with Charlie Coyle, and I think he would certainly fill a middle six center need for this team pretty thoroughly. Another underrated reunion candidate that I could see for the Minnesota Wild does come from the St. Louis Blues, and that is centerman Nick Bjugstad. So Bjugstad, they signed this offseason to a 2-year, $1.75 million contract, and the 6'6" center has won 51.3% of his faceoffs as the third line center for that Blues team. He, like kind of everybody else on St. Louis, has had his production drop off this season. It did drop off last year for the Mammoth as well. However, 2 years ago in Arizona, he was a 45-point player in 76 games. So I think if you're able to acquire him and unlock some of that offense, that could be a huge value add for this team. But at a bare minimum, you're bringing in a bottom six center who can help with your penalty kill. He wouldn't be a flashy grab by any means, but it does allow you to bump a guy like Ryan Hartman off the faceoff dot. Given that Hartman has been pretty poor at faceoffs this year, and he overall just helps strengthen the team down the middle in a way that I think would be really underrated for this squad. So up next, we have a forward that I noted had been rumored to the Wild earlier this year. At least the team had interest in him, as well as fellow Flyers forward Tyson Forrester, and that is Minnesota native Bobby Brink. Both of these names were mentioned when the team was potentially shopping Ryan Hartman after his really slow start to the year. However, I think given the acquisition of Quinn Hughes and obviously that necessitating a trade of Marco Rossi, the team's a little bit thinner at center. And so I don't think a trade for either of those guys, either Bobby Brink or Tyson Forrester, would happen without a coinciding trade for a center. Um, the reason for this is the Flyers apparently do have interest in Ryan Hartman. Um, Obviously, the initial trade that had been rumored was for Tyson Forrester, but Forrester is out for the entire year. So I think the idea of a trade for Bobby Brink is you are swapping this veterans kind of wing center in Hartman for a similar offensive producing scoring winger in Bobby Brink. But Bobby Brink is 24 years old, still has RFA status, and would give you some cost controlled scoring power in your middle six for the next couple years, while moving out a guy like Ryan Hartman, who has struggled this year, especially on that center dot. So I I'm not entirely sure if this trade would happen. Um, it might be something that the teams revisit in the offseason, especially surrounding Tyson Forrester. If the Wild could swing a Hartman for Forrester or Hartman for Brink trade, I wouldn't be opposed to it. But again, I think that's something that probably happens in the offseason as opposed to at this deadline. So, lastly, there's been a lot of talk about the Minnesota Wild acquiring a center via trade. However, my final dark horse candidate, again, is something that probably happens in the offseason as opposed to during this year, is moving Matthew Boldy to center, and instead of targeting a center in free agency, spending that money to grab a good scoring winger like Alex Tuck. This would be very dependent on how the center market swings in free agency as well as in the trade deadline. However, looking at the free agent class, there aren't a ton of great centers that you would consider to be like a 1C. I think Nick Schmaltz is probably the best one. Uh, and so I think it would really depend on what the Wild do in the offseason. However, looking at the face-off win percentage for players on the Minnesota Wild this year, Boldy is currently batting a 45.9 face-off win percentage, which, as you can see, lands him at sixth for players that still play in the Minnesota Wild organization. Uh, Boldy also has the sixth most faceoffs within the org. So he's behind Eriksson Ek, he's behind Hartman, he's behind Urov, Sturm, and Jones. Uh, However, Boldy's faceoff win percentage is higher than two starting centers for the team in Ryan Hartman and Danila Urov. I think the case for Urov is he just needs more reps. And so obviously I don't think they would move Boldy over to block Danila Urov from developing as a center. But I think potentially sliding Boldy over in a way that Hartman did in 2020 and 2021, and having him take over more of a face-off role would give the team that scoring centerman that they've been looking for, and would allow them to target instead a winger. Moving wingers to center is not something that has come out of nowhere. It is something that does happen somewhat regularly in the NHL. Boldy does have some pedigree of playing center. He played some at Boston College, and he has played it sporadically for the Wild, going back even to when Dean Evison was coaching, in attempts to really leverage some offense. But there was never a really serious attempt to get him to sit down and potentially be the 1C for this team. But if you look around the league to guys like Tage Thompson, who moved from wing to center in his fourth year in Buffalo, Logan Stankoven is doing it this year. Tomas Hertl did it his third year in the league. And like I mentioned, Ryan Hartman did it way into his career. It took him until 2020, 2021 for him to move to center just for the Minnesota Wild. And so you look at guys like Hartman, who is okay at taking faceoffs. He's certainly not anything spectacular outside of the past two seasons, where he had about a 47%, which is pretty decent. But I think Matt Boldy potentially sliding over to a center spot uh, could give this team some flexibility as to what their options are in the offseason. Uh, but again, I don't think this happens. I think the team is more likely to acquire a more traditional center. But I think it's at least an interesting thing to think about. So that just about wraps up the video today. If you have not checked out the article by Russo and Smith, I highly recommend that you do. There are a couple players that they mention in their article that I do not talk about. I don't think they're guys the Wild will end up going after, but nonetheless, it's a great read. I highly recommend checking it out. Um, what are your guys' thoughts on the upcoming trade deadline? Is there a guy that I didn't mention that you think the team should go after? Anything like that. So thanks for watching, and have a great rest of your day.